Thank you, and welcome to our program for today. It's entitled Climate Emergency, Hope Requires Action. Our speaker is Nancy Snyder, who is our league, one of our new leadership team members. And Nancy is a former social studies and language arts teacher who describes herself not as a scientist, oh boy, I'm sorry, not as a scientist, but rather as a student of history. And she brings that perspective to her study of climate
Recording
change.
stopped.
I'm sorry. Did the recording stop? Okay, I'll go on.
Recording in progress.
Oh, great. Okay. So she brings that to her study of climate change, and she's remarks on how civilizations, when they've turned away from science, they've been in decline, and as well as Holocaust survivors who warned about the danger of silence and indifference. So not wishing to ignore the extreme weather events along with the economic and human disasters, she decided to read climate change literature that was written for the average citizen's understanding. So this spurred her to action, and she joined our League of Women Voters Mason County Climate Change Committee. And then she attended the online climate reality training. So this was an outcrop of the Climate Reality Project, which was founded in 2005 to bring the world together to try to solve climate crisis. Oh. So, so now that she's done this, Nancy is in possession of the tools required to empower all of us to spread the word and understanding about the threat we face. Welcome, please, Nancy Snyder.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Amy was looking at Cindy. Cindy and I practice Zoom, so hopefully this will go well. I do want to emphasize a couple of things, and one of them is I do not pretend to be a scientist. My background is history. That's what my degree is in. And I also want to emphasize something that occurred to me after I made a presentation to the Climate Change Committee. Reading and research is kind of what history people do. As my parents said, what are you going to do with your history degree? And I said, well, I'm going to teach, I think. And so I've always been a researcher in that way. But I also wanted to share with you something that changed my life, and it has to do with the Holocaust survivors. I was fortunate enough when I was teaching to spend a number of hours interacting with the Holocaust survivors. I had some come and visit my classes. I took my students to Seattle to meet with them. And one of the things they emphasized was not the atrocities of the Holocaust. It was the silence and indifference of good people. And believe me, they really pounded that home to me and to other teachers that we could not be silent. And at the time, I thought to myself, I didn't feel myself indifferent, but I knew I had been silent. And so I became what I suppose would be called an activist, but my mistake, I decided, was that I did not put climate high enough. And so in the last 3 years, I've really focused on climate and ended up going to the climate reality training, and that brings me here. So I am going to try to share the screen and begin. I will ask that if you have questions, put them in the chat or ask me at the end, just because I lose my train of thought easily now, and I don't want to do that. So I begin here with my presentation, which is based basically on three parts. One, why am I doing this? Secondly, why is climate change happening, and why does it impact us, especially here in the Pacific Northwest in Mason County? And then finally, why is there still hope, even though there is this dire set of extreme weather events that we are witnessing? So let's start with, why am I doing this? And it begins actually back at the beginning of my teaching career. This is a picture that was taken by the Apollo astronauts in the early 1970s. And that was the same time that I began teaching. And it was in my second year of teaching social studies, aspects of history, that I received a pamphlet from the Flat Earth Society. And in it, it asked me as a teacher to teach an alternative theory of the Earth. And that was based on their belief that the Apollo mission was not reality, and that this picture, to use our modern language, was a hoax. And at the time, I dismissed it. And I did not talk to my students about it or anyone else as far as that goes, thinking that this was just sort of a fringe group that was dealing with this hoax mentality. But now that I live in the world I live in now, where alternative facts are present and conspiracy theories dominate some people, I look back and think I probably should have done more on this subject about how to be sure there are facts and how to seek them out. And so my work on climate change now is a little bit of atonement for my own inactions. Then I put this in because some of you, of course, already know the story of Cape Town, South Africa, that in 2018, faced with a very real crisis of running out of water for its citizens because of an extensive drought that had drug on for years. I happened to be in Cape Town in 2018. And by the time I got there, the crisis had eased a little, but the water restrictions were still very serious and very much in place. For instance, we were instructed that if we wanted to take a shower, we should turn on the water, get wet, turn it off, shampoo, soap up, then turn it on and rinse off. And our goal was to be done with the shower within a 1-minute time frame. And I thought Americans would struggle with this. And at the time, I gave it some thought, but recently I have given it much more thought. And I specifically look at the city of Phoenix, which is predicted to be the first American city to become uninhabitable by the middle of the century if action isn't taken. And that would be because of both the extreme heat that is increasing and the water shortage. And again, if you have followed the news recently, you know that the Colorado River is at its lowest level, that some farms have been told that they will not be getting irrigation water, that Lake Mead and Lake Powell are low, and there is even a danger of Hoover Dam not being able to produce electricity, hydroelectricity. And so it seems to me that Cape Town faced this, and the rest of the world needs to take a lesson from it, including cities that are facing extreme drought in the United States. And it was real in Cape Town, I can tell you that. And then finally, these are my grandchildren. I put them in here because I am a baby boomer. I'm a member of that generation. And for decades, our generation had the biggest voting bloc in the United States. And for decades, we had been warned about the oncoming climate crisis. And yet our generation did not take our voting power and demand action on climate. I'm sorry to say that there was a poll that was released, I think maybe 3 weeks ago, not that I put all of my faith in polling, but the poll said that 52% of Americans over 65 didn't believe that climate change would affect them in their lifetime. And I thought to myself, baby boom generation, you need to rise up. We still have voting power, we still have economic power, and we still have the ability to elect people that are actually going to take action. And that means at every level, local, state, federal, to make a difference. So here I am. If we don't do that, people like this set of grandchildren of mine, and I know of all of yours, will be facing a catastrophe in their lifetime, and they will have to deal with it. So let me move on then to why is it happening? This is an illustration of the sun's radiation. Comes in 3 spectrums, but we're going to focus just on the infrared spectrum, which is the heat. And the blue line on this illustration represents the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Now, if we didn't have sort of this increasing temperature, we may not see the same kind of problem, because we've always had greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is a natural byproduct. We've had them, and the Earth is operated in an equilibrium. So in theory, 50% of that infrared radiation would be absorbed by the Earth to make us an inhabitable planet. 30% of that infrared would be reflected right back out into outer space. And 20% of it would be absorbed by our atmosphere. And that's where we run into the climate emergency. As you can see on this illustration, most of the red arrows representing infrared are heading back where they belong, but some of them cannot make it through the increasing greenhouse gas level. And so they are turned back to the Earth. Now, that's not a big percentage. Of the 20% that would be absorbed, scientists estimate it's about 3% that is being turned back. But that 3% has been enough to raise the temperature about 1.2 degrees Celsius since the beginning of the industrial age. And that is beginning to have an impact. And unless we do something, more of those little red arrows are going to be heading back toward us, raising the temperature again. So what's causing this? Well, here you have a picture of lots of things. And of course, there are lots of things that are adding to the greenhouse gases. Down in the bottom, you see the agriculture. That has to do with grazing of animals, but it also has to do with how we plant things, how we till the soil, the amount of carbon that is left in the soil. So agriculture is an issue. In the right corner, you see the landfills. The decomposition in the landfills produce an enormous amount of methane. And then you see the forest question over on the far right, where we have lots of questions about the right way to manage our forests. This happens to be a picture of the burning of forest in order to have agricultural land. At the top, you see the thawing of the permafrost. For centuries, the permafrost has frozen carbon dioxide and methane in the soil, but now that it's melting, we see an increase, especially in methane. So there are lots of reasons, but in the training that I took, and in most of our literature now, we see that the biggest issue is the burning of fossil fuels. And so that's what my presentation focuses on, but certainly there are lots of other things that need to be considered. Now, another misunderstanding I found in the climate issues, the warming of the Earth, is about the jet stream and the polar vortex. The polar vortex is merely a low pressure area that has very cold air, and it's around both of the poles. And when it is stable, the jet stream is stable. And so the cold air stays where it's expected to be, around the poles. But when you have warming temperatures and melting ice at the poles, then you end up with a picture that sometimes looks like this. And the polar vortex becomes wavy, and the jet stream becomes wavy also. And so the cold air that would normally be captured around the poles begins to move south. And the warm air from the equator and the southern latitudes moves north. And when that happens, you get extreme weather events. And those have been increasing in recent years as this happens. So I want to emphasize that when you see a senator go to the floor of the Senate with a snowball in his hand as proof that the earth is not warming, then that's not an accurate statement. And why he makes it, I won't even go into, but cold extreme events happen, as do warm extreme events with the increasing temperature. So let me show you something that will look very familiar. This was in February of 2021. And the reason you'll know it is because of the word Texas on here. And you see what the jet stream looked like on February 15th, 2021. That warm, that pink line here that represents it. And that led to something that we all observed. And this is when the electric grid in Texas collapsed, when people were freezing to death in their homes, the lack of water because you didn't have electricity for a period of time. And this is a result of warming, although the temperatures were frigid in places that they weren't expected to be. Now, you could do the same thing if you did your own research and went to NOAA for September of 2021. The difference would have been, you would have seen the wavy jet stream, but what you would have seen is North Dakota, not Texas. And it would have been because North Dakota was experiencing 100-degree temperatures in this period of time, because everything had become unstable again. So you would see almost an identical picture, but the extreme event was the exact opposite of what happened in Texas. Now, so let's talk about temperatures. This is a 30-year period from 1951 to 1980. Looks like a normal bell curve. Cooler than average and warmer than average are basically pretty equal. So I'm going to put a baseline in here so that you will remember it as we look at the next slide of what this period looked like. Now is the decade we just finished, from 2010 to 2020. And you'll see that there's been a big shift. The cooler than average and average added together are less than the extremely hot days. And so what happens then is where you had extreme temperatures covering a very small fraction of the land area, they now cover about a quarter of it. And we can speak to that personally, having experienced the heat dome in June of this year here in the Northwest, where normally it would be 77 degrees average temperature in June. And in many of our homes, it was 108, 110 degrees. And so our land has now experienced that same extremely hot temperature as well. Now, why does this have an impact on us, especially here in the Northwest and potentially in Mason County? That's because while there is a lot of disagreement about exactly how to handle forest fires and wildfires and forest management, one of the things that has agreement is that when you have hotter years, you basically have more fires. And there are some simple reasons for that, actually. The snowpack melts sooner. In fact, spring usually comes sooner in these hotter years. A fact I didn't realize until I did the training is that with every 1 degree increase in temperature, the amount of lightning strikes increase about 10%. And so we know from our news coverage that many fires are started by lightning strikes. We also know from our basic science classes back in high school or college that the higher temperatures cause the plants to lose more water through transpiration. And so the plants themselves become like tinder, ready to erupt if a fire gets started. And we see in California always the extreme winds that come along with these fires and the hotter temperatures too. So that leads us to this kind of picture. This is from Medford, Oregon. I'm sure many of us have been there, when almost all of the citizens were asked to evacuate. Now, there are really two traumas here. One is the personal trauma of knowing that your house might be gone and you have to decide what's important enough to take, the stress on your health and on your mental well-being. But there's also an economic issue, because do you have insurance? Will your insurance cover the damage? Do you have a place to go? Will there be shelters open? If you are relatively poor, you may not have the money to go to a hotel. You may not have a car to get out of town. So there's an economic impact as well as a personal impact in experiencing the threat of fire. There is also the straight up economic impact. And this happens to be from the wine country of California, where they lost so much of their crop because of not only the fire, but the smoke damage. However, we could look to Eastern Washington in 2020 and see the same thing, where the fire damage and the smoke damage impacted some of the orchards and some of the crops. So there certainly is always going to be an economic sense in the truest form because of the higher temperatures and the fires that have come with it. And finally, this very famous picture from San Francisco of noon at San Francisco. There was a picture just like this earlier this year from New York City because of the smoke that had come from the West Coast fires. But again, in Mason County, we don't have to look at this picture because we experienced the smoke from the fires of British Columbia and Eastern Washington in September of last year, having difficulty breathing, seeing clearly across the lake where I live. And so again, there is an economic impact, but there is also a healthcare impact, especially for those people who have any kind of respiratory or underlying healthcare concerns. That is a cost that we all bear ultimately. So I looked up this information. This, what I'm about to share with you, comes from JP Morgan, which is hardly a left-wing think tank, but they sent out a letter to their investors in August of 2021, just a couple months ago. And they pointed out to their investors that 2020 had had more extreme weather events than the previous year or the year before that. In fact, there had been 22 of them that resulted in $100 billion in damages. And I'm quoting here from the JP Morgan investment advice, as they were telling their clients, we are on a dangerous pace for the next decade. So in 2021, beginning this next decade, there have already been 18 extreme weather events as of the end of September. And the cost in damages has been $105 billion. And when I was looking this up, I found that the heat dome over us in June was not listed as part of the damages. So I assumed that that amount had not been added into this message from JP Morgan. And I want to emphasize that because there's a great deal of debate about how much can we afford to do about mitigating climate change. And what isn't emphasized is how much we pay every single year for the damages of the climate crisis. So there's also this question. I think when people think about the warming of the earth, they think of land area. But actually, most of the heat gets trapped in the ocean. And that has a huge impact. The land-based water that is melting from the glaciers and the sea ice run into the ocean, and it dilutes the salt content of the ocean. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere makes the oceans more acidic, and the sea levels rise because warm water expands and the oceans need more space. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. I was surprised to read this statistic, and I emphasize I'm not a scientist, so I have to rely a little bit on the data that comes out of some of the climate organizations like the Union of Concerned Scientists. But the statistic was this, that the amount of heat that is captured by the ocean every second is equal to the heat generated by 5 Hiroshima A-bombs. And having taught that subject myself, I know what that heat did. And so I can only imagine what it is doing to the ocean, as we'll go on to talk about. Now, this is a satellite picture of the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to put in some names here so that you'll recognize the orientation. Hawaii to California. It is common sense for all of us to know that if the water is warmer and the air is getting warmer, then more water can be held. And that's what this is, called an atmospheric river. For 1 degree increase Celsius, the amount of water vapor the air can hold goes up about 7%. So it's estimated that this single atmospheric river held as much water as 25 Mississippi rivers. And again, common sense would say, well, where's that water going to go? And so here is a picture ironically taken in Phoenix, Arizona. This is called a rain bomb, where the sky literally opens up and drops rain. Probably today, Phoenix would kind of like some of that, but it would be too much at once. So let me call attention to something more close to us in history, and that is Tennessee. Earlier this year, Tennessee received 17 inches of rain in 24 hours in a rain bomb like this. And if you remember the pictures coming out of Tennessee of the flash floods that were wiping out communities and caused a human toll as well, a lot of deaths. That's the result of a rain bomb. If you are a tennis fan, you may have been watching the U.S. Tennis Open in September, and 3.5 inches of rain fell in 1 hour in New York City, which shut down the subway system and actually drowned people in their basement apartments. So flooding, many climate scientists say, is the first lethal thing that's going to happen to us as climate crisis intensifies. And we've already seen that here, certainly here in Washington State as well. But let's not get too carried away on the flooding, because there is also another issue with the increasing heat, and that is that the heat pulls moisture out of the soil, causing extensive droughts. We're experiencing one, we had experienced one in our own area here in Mason County this summer. We have seen it in California, where they have had about a 4-year drought. I was amazed to find, as I was looking this up, that at the end of August 2021, 2 months ago, 96% of the Columbia Basin was under drought conditions. So think about what that drought is doing. Even though I don't live in California, I buy produce from California. It produces 40% of the produce we eat in the United States. Look at the increase in prices for produce. Look at the increase in prices for meat as the drought hits parts of the country where beef are grazed. So it's easy to say it's not going to affect me because I live X, but there are effects that are hidden from us sometimes if we don't talk about it. Now, the warmer oceans also create the encouragement of producing toxins and depleting oxygen in the ocean itself. And when that happens, obviously, it kills marine life. You may have seen the pictures early this year from Florida, where thousands and thousands of sea creatures had washed up on the beaches of Florida, having died in the ocean and been washed in by the tide. But it also affects people. And I'm pretty sure anyone who's lived in the Pacific Northwest very long knows what red tide is, where we have been kept off beaches, or where we have been warned not to eat certain shellfish because of the toxicity. And so this warming ocean can have an impact on marine life and on human life. Now, let's bring it even closer to home. If you've lived here a long time, you probably remember this. In 2015, there was such a toxic algal bloom that the entire fisheries along the west coast of North America was closed down for a period of time. That resulted in the Dungeness crab and the razor clam seasons being shut down along our coast. It is estimated that the coastal communities like Westport and Ocean Shores lost $40 million in just tourist income during this closure. Then if you add the shellfish and fishery industry on top of that, this closure cost about $100 million in economic activity. So again, sometimes we lose sight of what that costs people along the way, and the situation is becoming worse because of what happened to us this summer. We got it up close and personal. Now, when I took this training, which was virtual, there were 5,000 people signed up for it over the globe. It was a global training. And I was not shocked, but kind of surprised to see a picture in the training from Shelton, Washington. And it's because of the damage the acidification has done to the oyster farms here. And we've had programs from Taylor United and the Squaxin tribe talking about the threat to their industry. And then this summer, when the heat dome came and the tide was low, we saw a different kind of destruction. Some of you may have seen the pictures from the Hamma Hamma Oyster Company on the internet, where they showed clams baking on the beach. We now know that more than 1 billion sea creatures were cooked alive in their shells during that June heat dome period. So I could not find the total cost of that. I don't know if it has been come up with yet. Maybe some of you already know it, but it had a major impact right here in Mason County. Now, suppose you are a fisherman, either recreational or commercial. Then you have this problem with the acidity of the ocean water, because it is beginning to dissolve the shells of free swimming marine creatures that feed the fish that you want to catch. And so we end up with this projection, which is about the fisheries, that by the end of the century, the ocean, lakes, and river waters will be too warm to support them during spawning. And so you might look at this and go, well, that's the end of the century. That's a long time off. But I encourage you then to look up the Klamath River in Southern Oregon and Northern California, where between the warmer temperature and the lower water levels, 90% of the young salmon were killed earlier this year. And so that has an impact right now, but it has an impact for the future for that fishery as well. And just this week, there was an article about Lake Tahoe and the Truckee River, where it is too low for the Lake Tahoe is too low for the spawning fish to get back into the stream and the river where they spawn. And so now they're trying to figure out workarounds about that. So it is a continuing problem even today, right now, October of 2021. Then there is also this issue that when you have a 1 degree rise in temperature at the equator, then you have a 3 degree greater rise at the poles, and that creates warmer water and a rise in the sea level. And so we have all of the stories about islands disappearing. But let's think closer to home. I frequently go to Ocean Shores. I have for years. And every time I go there, I go out and look at how much of the bank has eroded as those condos are sitting closer and closer to the ocean itself. But I don't have to go that far either. I can look around here. And so I want to share with you this picture of sea level rising. It happens to be from Miami. This, it's easy to look at this and say, oh, sure, that was after a big rainstorm or a hurricane. but it wasn't. This is called sunny day flooding. It happens anytime the tide comes in at any kind of level, and the water comes in into people's bathrooms through the sewers and through the drainage facilities. And this one reminds me of when the condo collapsed earlier this year. And if you remember, there was a great many questions raised about, has the foundation of that building been degraded because of the incoming seawater? And so they launched a structural engineering survey of all of the condos along the beaches here. I have not heard of them having published it. I doubt it is finished, but it certainly got the attention of the real estate industry in Florida. But again, lest you look at Florida and say, well, yeah, Miami, it's the first city that is going to be abandoned because of sea rise is the projection. But think about where we live, with the bay, with the canal, with the sound, Seattle waterfront. I think about it when I drive Highway 3 on my way home and look out and see the water not all that far from the road already. So many places in the state of Western Washington are starting to look seriously at what mitigating things can we do to save our communities. So those are a lot of things that are impacting us, and they are all kind of scary. And so that brings us to the hope part of the presentation. And I would be lying to you if I said to you that my hope meter doesn't fluctuate. When I finished the training, I was really feeling hopeful, because the innovation and the technology that is just racing to try to find mitigating answers is really, really positive and very hopeful. And then I look at the news and I see the attacks on scientists, both physical and or I should say actual and theoretical. But there is so much question about science, and why do scientists change their mind, and how could this be true? And the whole thing about it's a hoax. Then I go, oh gosh, can innovation keep up with the human tendency to question things? So here is the hopeful part of my presentation. The first one starts with coal. This graph represents a number of coal plants that had been approved in this period, and yet more had not been completed than had been completed. And so if we move to the next 2 years, again, all of these have been approved by local communities to be built to create electricity generation plants. And yet look how many were never finished. And the reason for that is that a lot of the investment companies like JP Morgan that I quoted earlier are moving away from coal. They see it as losing the market, if you will, and they are taking their money and investing it elsewhere. Maybe it's out of the goodness of their heart, and maybe it isn't. It doesn't really matter. It's had an impact on what climate scientists consider to be the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. And if you've ever ridden a steam train, like from Durango and Silverton in Colorado, you know that when you get off, you are filthy because of the soot and particulates in the air. And so even China has cut back on coal plant facilities and closed some, and announced just recently they wouldn't be financing some. However, there is also a growing energy shortage in parts of the world, and that would again push us a little bit back toward coal. But it seems to be the conclusion of investors and climate scientists that coal is probably on its way out. Now, what's replacing it are things like wind energy. And again, innovation is what gives me hope. It is estimated that there is enough wind blowing on this earth to supply energy 40 times over. But the trick is to capture it. And the new wind turbines are much more efficient than the first generation ones. It's said that one rotation of a turbine can power the average home for 2 days. And if you followed the news on climate, you know that the United States is entering wind farm territory. Europe has been there, but now there are 7 leases being examined in terms of can they be put offshore, both the East Coast and the West Coast. The East Coast is easier because there is not a dramatic drop off of the ocean shelf. The West Coast is harder. It will be pricier because they would have to do floating wind farms off the coast. The one being proposed is off the coast of Oregon. So no matter what, we are gaining more wind energy, and the costs of wind energy are going down. The same could be said of solar. Lots of infrared energy comes that would meet our needs. And technology, again, is making a giant progress. The new photovoltaic cells convert about 50% of the sun's infrared radiation into usable electricity, whereas the first generation, it's about 20%. I have solar panels installed here about 6 years ago. And while it makes a difference to my electric bill, it does not capture, they do not capture 50% of the sun's energy yet. And at some point, you know, maybe we'll look at putting more efficient ones in. You can also roof your house now with solar panels. Again, much pricier, but it can be done that you roof your house and produce your energy in the same way. So that means that solar capacity is going up very, very fast. And the cost of solar energy is going down very fast as well. And so if you put those two things together, you see a very rosy looking pie chart. And this is from 2020. And I have to caution you, this is about new capacity. That is, all of the new energy generated in 2020, 80% of it was from renewable energy. However, if I were to put up a lovely little pie chart showing you all of the energy generation in 2020, solar and wind would shrink considerably as fossil fuels still dominate electricity generation. But still, it is a positive thing. Another positive thing is shown in this picture. It's called pay-as-you-go solar. This is a picture from the Sudan. Most people in the developing countries can't afford to buy solar systems and install lots of solar panels, but they can afford small amounts. And like this home generates its own power. This is still not common, but it is increasing. When we were in Africa out in the bush, we found a single cell, and we asked about what is it doing out here in the middle of nowhere? And it was being used to power a small well that brought water up to the watering hole for the elephants and the zebras. And so our guide told us at the time that there were lots of ways that entrepreneurs and small business were trying to develop a solar power. And the good news for them is that they can skip the infrastructure system that we have with poles and wires, as they skipped it in cellular phone technology. What I found interesting when I started looking at this is there are lots of startup companies, including American, but more European, that are looking at the improvement of batteries. And they're becoming cheaper, and they can store battery power better. And so small businesses in developing countries are buying, for instance, battery-powered refrigerators. And they came to my attention because developing countries needed a way to keep COVID-19 vaccine cold. And so you see much more development of companies, there are lots of them, going into the business of developing solar-powered stoves and refrigerators in the developing world. Now, it is also true that generating electricity is not the only way we use fossil fuels. And that is in the transportation sector, which is the largest of them. So this is what is good news. This is the line for what I would call hybrid cars. And this is the line for battery electric cars. And you can see that the cost tipping point is only 2 years away, where the cost of fossil fuel cars is going up and the cost of battery powered cars are going down. And I really believed this when I saw that Ford Motor Company announced an $11 billion investment just this past month to build 3 battery plants and 1 EV plant, electric vehicle plant, where it's going to build its F-150 pickup Lightning. And when automobile manufacturers, all of the major ones, have announced that they are going to phase out internal combustion engines, Ford says that by 2030, 50% of its vehicles will be battery powered electric. And in the infrastructure bill that they're wrangling about, there is money for a nationwide charging network so that people can get in an electric vehicle and find a place to charge. Just as when I drive across eastern Montana, I always look for where are the gas stations before it is too late. So there certainly is a change coming in automobile transportation. But cars aren't the only things on the road. There are lots of semis. This happens to be the Tesla, which is a little bit further ahead than anyone else. But all major truck manufacturers have announced that they too are going to move away from the diesel engine and move to electricity. So it is coming. And then there are buses. 40% of the world's buses, most of this happens to be in China, this big reduction. But even in the United States, we are seeing cities electrifying their fleets. Europe is a little ahead of us, but it is changing. And much to my heart's joy, school districts are looking at the possibility of changing their fleets. In the state of Washington, we will have 325 electric buses by 2024, paid for by the Volkswagen settlement over emissions. And there is actually one of them in Mason County, in Mary M. Knight School District. If you have ever ridden a school bus with your lovely children on a field trip and inhaled the diesel fumes from a school bus, you will know that that can't be good for the environment or for health. So I'm really excited that there is a movement in that direction. And then there is the question of how do we move power from where the sun is shining or the wind is blowing and where it isn't. This is one example. This is the longest undersea one, but there are others under consideration and research for how can we quit losing energy in transmission by building super grids with that purpose, but more importantly, by building mini grids where the electricity generated would be used in the same area, which would cut down the need for long transmissions and would make it a more stable source and less threatened by other extreme climate events. And then I couldn't do this without talking about LEDs. There's always this discussion of how great incandescent light bulbs were. And I know the heart attack I had when I first bought an LED bulb and how much it cost. But notice how fast the cost has gone down. They're 75% more efficient. They last, they say, 25 years longer. But most importantly, they don't give off that heat from like the incandescent one. If you remember changing incandescent bulbs when they burned out, you could burn your fingers on them from the heat that was being lost from them. So this is a real positive, and we have really made the change to LED in the United States. And finally, there's always the question of jobs. What will we do? But maintaining and installing wind turbines and solar panels are jobs that cannot be exported, and they do not require a college degree. They are jobs for all kinds of people that would be here. And then if we actually start really manufacturing our own supply chain and our own solar panels and our own wind turbines, that is a huge boost to our manufacturing industry. And then here is my greatest hope. These are young people. I have been to a rally by young people on climate, and they are articulate and they are knowledgeable and they are demanding that old people do something. the little gal here, you will die of old age and we will die of climate change. So they are serious and they are really organizing and they will become voters. Then I added this because I was reminded at the training, and I have a tendency to forget this. This is from Pope Francis, who reminds us that in the climate crisis and in all environmental crises, it is the poorest people who suffer the most. And if you think about it, where do the pipelines generally go in the United States and in other countries too, across indigenous lands? And where do the highways go? Not through gated communities, but through poor communities. If you've ever read the stories of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, the life expectancy of people who live by the petrochemical plants. And so I say this because, and I've been guilty of this, I have lots of things I care about. And I have to get to the place where I realize that if we all work together on the climate crisis, then the things I care about will also be addressed. And so the last things I want to show you are a little controversial. This is Central America, and you notice the drought, which has been going on for years in this area. And that leads us to this picture, which we see on our news all the time, of people coming to the southern border. In the United States, we have a tendency to think that everything is about us. But these are just examples of refugees. There are millions of climate refugees already moving on this earth. And some of them are coming to our borders, of course, but they're going elsewhere. And the reason is when you have a climate crisis and you have, let's say, an extended drought, then there is competition for resources, for water, for food, for land areas to move away from disasters. And so people begin to move. And that leads to the kind of fighting we see in Central America. I'll give you another example, a war that we have been involved in for a long time. That is the Syrian war, the civil war, which started because they had a 10-year drought. The farmers couldn't survive. They moved to the cities. There were no jobs in the cities. People in the cities resented them. There was a conflict over religion, a conflict over land, and the civil war has continued, even though our involvement has lessened considerably. So those kinds of things happen. At the root of it is a climate issue that we tend to overlook and look at the others. So if immigration is an important issue to you, then climate has to be a really big one, because it is our own Defense Department that said the greatest national security threat we face in the future is climate. And so we have got to act. And so you received one of these. I just want to emphasize that this was my own little brainstorming about things that could be done. But I want to emphasize that individuals, this is too big for individual action. This requires policy action. This requires money. And so the most important thing any of us can do is to question people we vote for about how what they believe about climate, what they believe about science, and make our votes count that something is going to happen. So I appreciate you listening to me for that long, and I will get my thing out of there. And so I'd be happy to answer questions if I can.
And we appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was really spectacular. I just wanted to mention, I wrote down a few items as you were speaking that I thought were good terms to remember. And that was the rain bomb, heat dome, unstable polar vortex, weakened jet stream, economic security risk, red tide, neurotoxins, algae bloom, shellfish cooked alive in their shells, acidic water, degraded concrete foundations. It appears that science fiction is coming true.
I kind of worry about that.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from, oh.
Yeah, Linda, I don't have a question, a comment. I watched the PBS NewsHour last night. They did a special on white paint, new type of white paint that's whiter than white you can imagine, put on roofs of houses all over Arizona and hot places, and it would almost eliminate the need for air conditioning.
Right.
New stuff, positive changes.
Yes. Purdue University has, I don't know if it's on their website or whatever, but they were the people who did the investigate and research on it. And it's really interesting what they said. I'm going to do what I usually never do, and that is I'm going to recommend a book I haven't read yet. Okay. It just came out in September, and I have it, but I haven't read it. It's by a climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe, Hayhoe. And her book is called Saving Us. And the reason I mention her is because she is a foremost climate scientist, but she is an evangelical Christian. And she comes at this with recommendations for how to convince people that there is an issue and that humans can do something about it. And I want to quote her. Where is she? She says, and this is, I have read a lot of her interviews, it's about everyone else who doesn't understand why climate change matters or what they can do about it. And so she talks about the fact that most people believe in climate change now. There's only 8% of the people who say it isn't real. And she dismisses them. She said, I can't change their mind. But she says, it is human nature to look at a problem and say, oh, that's really bad. But I don't want to sacrifice to solve the problem. It's human nature. And so she said, what we need to do is to convince people that there's a community involved and small sacrifices might make a difference to the greater community. So I haven't read her book, but I've read enough about her that I think it might be useful in discussions. So I pass that along.
I have a couple of comments, Nancy. I thought it was interesting that you talked about the oyster fishermen and how they've been really bumming out. I did a fisherman's tax return in 2020. Okay, so last year, and he is still talking about 2015. They had a horrible time, and not just in the oyster industry, but the gooey duck industry. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know that. It was pretty powerful. You mentioned a programmable thermostat. Can you go into that? What's the difference between that one and a regular one?
I have one.
Okay.
It's smarter than I am. I'll tell you that. But it can determine when it's time to come on, and if the temperature is evened out, or if there's been a change in the temperature, it will take care of the temperature in my home for me. Now,
so you don't have to walk by and constantly turn it up or turn it down. That's what the difference is, right?
Well, and if I were smarter and more technologically savvy, then I could go to my phone wherever I am and change anything. I do not. My children do that.
Okay.
I think all of your children probably do that. Yeah. But it saves money in that it takes care of fluctuations for you, so you're not heating when you don't need to, or whatever. So
okay, and then the last thing that I'm going to say is, obviously this workshop spurred you to action, but what was the one thing or the first thing that you thought that, hey, I can do this and it will bring about change?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I have thought about it a lot. When I first started into this, I had hoped to go in person, and get really inspired by sitting with a group of people and sitting in front of my computer virtually, not so inspiring. So I was talking to my husband, many of you know him, and he's a lawyer, so he thinks like a lawyer. and he said, "Are you just tilting at windmills like Don Quixote? You know, what are you going to do here in Mesa County?" And I said, and that's when I told you in the beginning about the Holocaust survivors, that if I did nothing, I was no better than the good people who sat around and watched the people be taken into the camps. You know, I mean, I had to do something, and I recognized my limitations. I've told the Climate Change Committee, I think, that I feel like Paladin, and I'm dating myself when I say this because some of you aren't old enough to have watched Paladin, Have Gun Will Travel. But I have a presentation and I will travel. I will go to the big meetings and the small meetings. I will go anywhere that people feel that they don't understand or they don't see, or like you, Cheryl, didn't remember that algae closure in 2015 and what it did to our own communities, you know. So I guess that's why it's really my interaction. And I will tell you this, and I might tear up when I do it. I was sitting beside an older gentleman. He must have been 85. And he was lecturing me about the responsibility of teachers. I mean, he was a nice man, but he was 85, you know, 85 people, your old people lecture people anyway. And so he said to me, he said, would you like to see something on my arm? And so, see, he rolled up his sleeve and his number from Auschwitz was carved into his arm. See, I told you I'd tear up. It was carved into his arm. And it wasn't anything like I expected. I expected a stencil mark, you know. I'd never seen this as much as I'd studied it. It took from his wrist to his elbow, and it was just incredible. And I've carried that with me ever since. That individual people have to do something, even if in the end it doesn't do any good. And then, of course, I do love my grandchildren. And they're very into doing something about climate change. Anyway, I'm sorry. I knew I'd tear up if I said that.
Okay, we see Michelle.
Yeah, Nancy, I would just like to echo Amy's comments. That was just such an excellent presentation, and your slides were just perfect. So I think you can tell your husband that you're taking your action by doing that presentation. First, excuse me, helping us. And, you know, some of those things we probably already knew about, but we hadn't put them all together in that same way. Excuse me. So I think it would be fabulous if you could take your show on the road, so to speak, because you've got a wonderful presentation that covers all the, well, as many as I can think of anyway, the important points about climate change and the impacts on us. And I hope more people get to see it.
Thank you. Could I ask a question?
Yes.
I tried to tailor this to the Pacific Northwest and Mason County. Did I achieve that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. I think what brought it home for me anyway was the picture of the oyster beds in Shelton, you know, with the empty bins, and that you said, you know, it was used for an LWVUS presentation. So yeah, that was really good. Randy, you're muted. There you go.
One quickly I wanted to mention, I read a lot of history books, and speaking of the Holocaust, this is a little off the subject, but I'll be quick. I'm reading a book currently called Dressmakers of Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating book. I also want to mention, I have a heat pump. All my tools are electric, and I love them. I think the private sector has done a lot as far as environmental stuff, and come out with a product that the market likes. I love my electric lawnmower. I don't have to mess with oil or gas, anything like that. But my question was, you had showed the graphic of new sources of sustainable energy. I did not notice hydro. Hydro is sustainable energy, although for some weird political reason, the state of Washington does not recognize it as sustainable. But if your overall graph, which you didn't show but you referred to, would that have included hydroelectricity? Thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. This was just new capacity in that 1 year to show that the market increase is going up for solar and wind. But hydro, on a big picture, hydro does appear, yes. And it's not insignificant, but there are lots of places in the United States where hydro isn't a big factor like it is here in Washington. Incidentally, I want to second it. I just bought an electric lawnmower last month. It is fantastic. It really is.
I bought mine a few years ago. One thing is the battery is so heavy. I have trouble getting it into the lawnmower. But my brother bought one last year. The battery is twice as many amps or whatever, a lot smaller, a lot lighter. So
Yep.
Being the cheapskate I am, I'm going to wait till it dies before I get another electric lawnmower. But oh no, I love it.
Cindy, you have a comment?
Yes, I do have a comment, and it's related to advocacy and Nancy's suggestions, and she has vote for climate candidates on her list. And I just wanted to put out the idea, now that our county is able to put out a voter's pamphlet for local elections, and we all have one right now in our house. Every one of the candidates has a contact information on their description, either a phone number or an email or mailing address. So candidates are accessible. And even if there's only one candidate running for a position, now is a really good time to just pick a few that you might like to contact personally to say, for example, in a fire district, school district, or a PUD, or, all of those positions, make decisions for our local situation that are related to decisions about equipment, about their practices, their policies. This comes down to right down the street from us. And if we would say to candidates, I am most interested in knowing your position about decisions related to climate in our county or in the fire district or school district. What are the things that you would support in our school district that would help to bring down use of fossil fuels?
Cindy, I'm going to interrupt you really quick. I'm wondering if maybe we could make this into a formal study. Get all maybe after the election, poll all of the elected officials and see where they stand on it. Does that sound like something that, we would want to take farther?
Well, I think, if we individually chose a few people to contact, to put top of mind, there are people in our county who care about your decisions related to climate. And you're a single person who's volunteered to run for the port, the port commission or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to think about making decisions based on the effect on climate in Mason County. I just think it would be, this is a good time. People are, thinking about their new job as a fire district commissioner, for example. So it's an advocacy position. The other thing is, in our tri brochure, we have how to contact all of these people who've already been elected. And, some of them are basically one contact for the entire school district or so on. But, local is where it happens. And Nancy, you did a wonderful job of bringing it right back here to Mason County. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Yes, Lynn.
I just want to note that Mason Web TV has recorded Nancy's presentation, and thank you, Deidre, for doing that. And if each of us would forward that link to at least one person or more, doesn't have to be a league member, someone, a neighbor, a friend. It doesn't even have to be someone living right here in Shelton. I think that would be great in spreading the word. It's a perfect presentation. Thank you, Nancy.
Anything else? Anyone else?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment. Brenda
Yeah.
Hershey here. So Nancy, I was so impressed. That was outstanding. And I think it is ready to go on the road and to show everyone that will listen. But I want to make a comment here. What I see missing is that we are all concerned here about this, and we're all on board with that. But you know, if you take that tribe brochure that Cindy just put up, look on there and see all of the positions that are coming open in 2022. Will anyone amongst us be brave enough to step out there and put our name down that we're ready to run for election? I've been defeated. I never won, but I worked my rear end off. And I'm telling you, it's a lot of work. But that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. When people who believe like we do that we are facing a real problem, we're going to step up and we're going to put our name in and get back in the ring, so to speak. Thank you for listening to me.
Hear, hear. Anything else? Randy.
I was just going to say, very excellent. All information is good. Nancy, I do belong to several organizations I think would be interested. Can I contact you about that? And
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Absolutely.
Hey, anything else? Yes, Linda.
There is an organization that compiles voting records of people who are voting in the Congress. It's called Conservation Voters. I can't remember what it is, but it has all their environmental related votes and how they do. It rates them. So I'll find out what that is and let the league know. Probably a lot of people already know about it. It's just a list of candidates and how to vote for them, depending on how they vote on our environmental issues.
It's Washington Conservation Voters. It's the name of the organization, and they have a website, of course.
Washington Conservation Voters.
Yes.
Okay.
Washington Conservation Voters.
I'm going to put that on the chat. Okay, anything else?
I have one more comment, Cheryl.
Yes, Cindy.
Related to the earlier announcement about the march in Washington that
Yes.
the U.S. League of Women Voters is doing today.
Yeah, I was going to go over that one more time, but yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say one thing about it, and then you can say your thing too. We'll double it. Since we aren't there, the idea is to call. But another thing we can do for those of us who are so inclined is write a postcard. And I know we had a wonderful time writing postcards in the past. And so our two senators could hear for us through a postcard campaign as well. So just a thought, and all of the information is in our tribe brochure.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, at the beginning of the chat, so if you scroll all the way up on the chat, it's got Maria Cantwell and Senator Cantwell and Senator Murray's email address, and it will tell you, the webpage tells you how to most effectively get in the kind of testimony that you want to get in. So that march is today in Washington, D.C. The only way you can participate, unless you fly there and have a time machine, is to register your comments on those two websites. Amy, do you want to go over the action workshops again quickly?
Oh, I'm sorry. I completely lost contact with the internet. And so
Oh,
I haven't heard a thing for about 15 minutes.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. What
but-
we're doing is we're just wrapping up, and would like you to go over the action workshops again.
Okay. All right. So December 11th, December 4th and December 11th. So, the voter will have all that information. The
Okay.
League of Women Voters Washington will have that information. So look for that. It should be in their calendar, and there's probably going to be a way very soon to sign up for that. But it's only October, so we have another month, but look for that. The workshops will be on both justice and in the environment. So
So
anybody's interested in that.
Are
Yeah.
both of them I mean, is there one, like, so the 4th is going to be on justice and the 11th is going to be on environment? Are they talked about at the same meeting? Do you know?
No, they're different.
Okay.
So they're, climate on one and justice on the other. So,
Okay. So we'll look in the voter for meeting registration information.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
Is there anything else for anybody? Nancy, you did a splendid job. And I would be interested to see maybe an update in 6 to 8 months. Because you have a couple of open-ended questions there that, we have to see what happens.
Can I ask a question, since I haven't been here, so I don't know what all the questions were?
Yeah, of course.
But I think Nancy's presentation is a reasonable presentation. And I've been having trouble lately because I find that people who are climate deniers are basically unreasonable. I'm wondering, how can we be unreasonable in order to get things done? Is that the right approach? And what would something like that look like?
Let me, you weren't here were you here when I recommended a book I haven't read?
Yes, I did. Saving Us. Yes, I did.
She speaks to that.
Oh, good.
But she says very clearly, I don't know if any of you follow the Yale School of Communications on climate. They do a lot of polling and surveying and stuff. And they divide the American public into 6 categories, from people like me who are alarmed, the house is on fire people, to what she calls dismissive people who won't even listen to you. And she argues that you just ignore the dismissive, which she says is less than 10%. And you go for the people she calls disengaged, who pay no attention to it, and doubtful people. And I mentioned that she was an evangelical, and I mentioned that for a reason, in that I would never get away with saying this to some people I know. But she says one of the things that happens is that people see the problem and they don't want to sacrifice themselves. But if they didn't accept the problem, they would feel like they were bad people, and no one wants to be a bad person. So they look for reasons. And she says, sometimes there's sciencey reasons, like, well, the earth is always cooled, and heated, which is true, but not in the crisis mode we're in now. But she said more Americans reach for she calls them religious-y reasons, that God is deciding whether we'll burn up or not. And that's her, that's not me. I would never say that to anybody. But she's trying to tackle the sciencey and religious-y reasons with the doubtful and disengaged. That's sort of her mission. And so as I said, I haven't read her book. I've heard she does a TED Talk. If you're into TED Talks. So I think she would say there is a certain number of people that you don't waste your time on. Somebody who just says, no, it's BS. And she uses those words. But she would say, there are people who just don't understand. It's one of the things I liked about the training I took. It was not heavy in science. It was more about like the illustration of the red arrows, where the heat's coming from and why it's not going back. She said, people just don't know. And if they can get a little information and not feel like a bad person, or it's one of the reasons I did that handout. If people start doing even the tiniest thing and feel good about it, Randy's not wrong about an electric tool. It makes you, we put solar panels on, not that we're going to save a lot of money. It'll take a long time to pay them off, but I feel better. And it pushed me a little farther. So that's her argument. Now, I hope her book isn't just awful. I mean, I hope not. But I like what she has to say about how to try to meet people. She also says this, Amy, and this might be helpful, that the first thing she does with someone who is not sure about it is to ask them what they have observed about the weather. What have you observed? And she said she got this guy who started off telling her that she was a liberal, so-and-so. And she said, well, what have you noticed about your weather? And he said, well, I don't have any water to feed my cows. I had to sell my herd. And she said, well, is that new? And then she got a decent conversation with him. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I thought that's actually probably smart. Mm-hmm. Like if you said to people where we live, what was it like when it was 110 at your house? And then people will say, well, that isn't like it usually is here. Yes. Well, here's, maybe some information. So I thought she had a valid point there about something simple like that. Anyway, who knows?
Randy, you have something? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Amy, were you done?
No, go ahead.
Okay, Randy?
I'm having a senior moment. I was going to say, I talked to a lot of people. Oh, first of all, yeah, I've talked to people, I'm in the middle of my sentence and they'll say, don't believe in BS. Well, to me, all information is good. I may not agree with you, but I'll listen to you. And the people that have already made up their minds, I don't know what you can do. I try to combat it. I say, look, at least listen to me. I was going to say, though, I've talked to a lot of people in the community. I haven't met anyone who is other than wants a clean Mason County. But there is a natural tension between you do things to mitigate environmental concerns, but what's the cost? And that's kind of a natural tension. And for example, I could get rid of a lot of pollution tomorrow, shut down Sierra Pacific. Well, some people would argue, no, that's too big of a cost. So, but one aspect I like about some of the things going on legislatively is they don't make everybody do it. It's not done all at once. They're defining a glide path to get to where we want to go. But I think there will be some tension. You will get some pushback, not necessarily because they're anti-clean environment, but because they say, well, the cost is too great right now. It would disrupt too many things. So that's what I have to say. Thank you for the time.
So are we saying that our 35th representatives are climate deniers and because they're not willing to change policy? Or are they looking at the cost of changing a policy and the economic cost in the long run, perhaps, of not changing the policy?
I think those are questions you should ask. And I've
yes, we should.
I agree. And I've talked to Dan Griffey, and at least he tells me he's interested or willing to talk to the Climate Change Committee or whoever to defend his point of view, which I know many don't agree with him, but at least listen to him. You may end up still disagreeing with him, but I think his basic argument is Yeah, the cost for whatever is too high right now for the benefit you're trying to achieve. But yeah,
Too
no,
high right, yes, too
You're-
high right now.
yeah, you may disagree with that. You may say, well, I think the cost is reasonable, but that's a discussion that should be had. You don't just, I don't personally believe you dismiss people's point of view, and I definitely don't agree with you put labels on people themselves. That's irrelevant. Listen to what they have to say, listen to their argument.
I think when we have our lobby week, we should really try to advocate for this with Dan Griffey if he decides to meet with us. I think that would be a good first step.
Perfect. Yeah. Yes, Cindy.
Well, and I think that Nancy's presentation was really excellent at pointing out the current cost to the economy of Mason County because of the heat dome this summer, but also think about 2015. So the cost right now is really great. How are we going to make progress so that to save these industries that are so important here, especially shellfish and other fishing. It's not going to do anyone any good to be working at Green Diamond or anywhere else if the trees are dying, or burning up, so I think there's a way of connecting what's the real cost right now. The problem is figuring out how to make steps towards change that's actually going to help correct that economic cost that our industries are facing. So we want to get them thinking in terms of not do nothing, but instead what can be done that you would support, perhaps. I don't know. It's a thought. Nancy, thank you so much for making it close to home.
We tried. Thanks, Cindy, for practicing with me.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. I have 1:30 now. So is there anything else for the good of the order? All right. Well, with that, we are adjourned and we will see you next month.